Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
I wanted you to hear this argument that was so live here in the shop a couple days ago. That would have been part of the sound that you would have heard in Exodus 14. That's what we're looking at tonight. Exodus chapter 14. It's the conversation at the Red Sea and the battle that takes place there. Exodus 14 is this conversation that is not so quiet as we might have if we were standing around here discussing, I'd like to get across the Sydney Harbor. How would you get across the Sydney Harbor? Hey, I know, let's take the boat. Oh, I know, let's build a bridge. Oh, I know, let's wait until the dry season. There are all kinds of ideas that we might have, and we might discuss it quietly and calmly. But the reason I played that audio for you earlier was that cacophony of Jewish argumentation is exactly what you'll see here in the text tonight. So let's look. Exodus 14. God has made this chessboard look exactly right. He said, I want you to go up here, take a knight's move, take a bishop's move, come back over here in front of the pawn. There you are. That's where I want you to be. Sure enough, then Pharaoh, king of Egypt, an odd introduction, isn't it? After we've had so many other conversations with him over the last 10 chapters. But here he is, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and all the king's horses and all the king's men start chasing after Humpty Dumpty and all the Jewish people. See what's happening? And they go to the exact spot so that they can checkmate the Jews. That's what's happening. And God is going to finally harden Pharaoh's heart, as he's done so many times. Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? He's mean, isn't he? He just wants to beat up on people.
Because God's will will be shown up. His hard-heartedness, God will be exalted.
So, in Pharaoh's hard-heartedness, God will be exalted. That's spot on. That is exactly right. Where did the heart hardening start? Pharaoh first chose to disregard God and hardened his own heart, and God, as a response, hardened it back. Then Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then God again hardened Pharaoh. So it went back and forth between man's will and God's will that seemed to line up perfectly. Pharaoh was already leaning that way, and as a result, he's going to become a hard-hearted guy. But what's the purpose of that? You said so that God
will be exalted.
Will be exalted. Look at verse number 4. I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and, God says, the Egyptians will know that I'm God, meaning all the other gods are not God. So the purpose of God is manifest, that he wants to draw people to himself, always. He wants little kids, he wants grandparents, he wants everybody in between to know God. He wants Egyptians, Gentiles, pagan idol worshippers to know the living God. That's pretty awesome, that he loves everybody. I don't know how many times I get asked this question, and maybe you do too. Well, if Jesus really is the Messiah or something, then what about all those other people who don't believe? What about the tribes in Africa or the people who lived in China in 400 AD? What about them? Well, what about them? What's your answer to that?
They can know God by his creation, and they can be missionaries too.
So you said two things, and they're both excellent. Number one, God demonstrates himself through creation. You go stand at the beach at Bondi. You go stand outside at the Blue Mountains if you can handle the cold right now. And you say, who created this? You're not going to say who created this mess. That's what you're going to say when you look at the ASX or the Qantas A380 that spilled water all down the aisle last night. Left Los Angeles and 30 minutes later turned back around and landed because water was pouring out of a tank somewhere down the middle aisle. It wouldn't have been dangerous, but it would have just been uncomfortable as people were walking in their socks. But you look at those things and you say, who made this mess? And you'll look at a human engineer, you'll look at some random act of some person. But if you look at the Blue Mountains, you don't say who made this mess, you say who made this gorgeous beauty. If you look at the beach at Bondi, I'm not talking about the cigarette leftovers and the syringes, but if you look at the beach and the waves, you say, who made this beauty? So you're right, creation itself speaks loudly of a creator. And if we don't, and Romans 1 says that very thing, so that no one has an excuse, it says, Romans 1:20. No one has an excuse because he's made it so clear that he is the painter of the world. And secondly, you said, there were missionaries. And so people left, like the Apostle Thomas. He went to India. And he died in India. This is one of the Jewish guys, Doubting Thomas, who didn't doubt anymore. And he was one of the 12, right? And he went to India. And he ministered the gospel. And you're right. As the Jews were evicted one place or another, as here we are in Egypt and just exiting, then the Egyptians have an opportunity to hear about the living God. That's pretty cool.
In this context, the book of Jonah should be noticed.
It's very telling, isn't it? So Jonah, who is a Jewish prophet, is told by God at Tel Aviv, Joppa, to go to the Ninevites and preach about God. And he says, I don't think so. And he goes and finds a whale that eats him, right? But on the way to the whale, he's on this ship. Great story. He's on a ship, and what happens? Waves crash against it. These seafaring men, sailors, rough and tough guys, get scared, think they're going to die. Wow, if they get scared, what's Jonah, who's just a little guy,
He was sleeping.
He was sleeping downstairs. And after a while and a bit of a shake-up, he says, yeah, I'm the problem. So throw me overboard. They don't want to do that. They try rowing. That doesn't work. So they throw him overboard, and immediately the place stops. And immediately the guys who were on that boat, the mariners, have a worship service to the living God. So you're right. In every one of our circumstances, when we're obeying or disobeying, like Jonah, the living God, because he went the wrong way, we give the heathen opportunities to encounter God. Because God will use our disobedience as well as our obedience, because He loves all people. He even loves teenagers. He even loves Kiwis. He loves everybody. He loves those who beat up your team in the World Cup. We're talking about God who cares about all people and will use Jews and later on the believing community of faith to go to China, to go to India, to go to Australia, to go anywhere and everywhere, even to the pagan Celts and Gauls and Americas, and tell the good news of Yeshua. So that's the point. That's why we do what we do, so that people can hear, so that all the nations of the earth will know that He's the Lord. That's it. In obedience, I recommend better than disobedience. So that's the hardening of the heart. And verse 4, so that the Egyptians will know that I'm the Lord. So they chased after him and got to Baal Zephon. Verse 10, as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked. What is it saying there? They lifted their eyes, really. What does that mean? What does it mean that the sons of Israel looked? You've been out for a few hours, maybe a day, you've got lead on Pharaoh. And then he changes his mind. You think, mind you, there are 3 million Jews. Try to organize 100 people on a camp trip to all go in the subway and the trains together. Take 200. Take 1,000. Now, take 3 million, including a whole lot of Jewish people who like to be in charge. What do they say? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So you got 3 million Jews. How many opinions are there going to be, right? No, we should turn left. Now remember that rock out there. We should turn. What are you, nuts? I don't want to go that way. Look, the sea is over here. So you get all kinds of people who are going to have all kinds of ideas. They've been slaves for hundreds of years. So they're used to being told what to do, but now they've got this liberty. They have narrowly escaped. They've heard the cries of the Egyptians through the 10 plagues, including the most horrible one, the death of the firstborn all over Egypt. And it's one thing when hail and flies wipe out crops. It's another thing when kids are wiped out. The sound was grievous to anyone who really had compassion. And here they escape. Pack up everything. Go to your neighbors. Get the gold and the purple and let's get out of here. 4 days they had after 400 years of slavery. 4 days to pack up and get out of town. So they didn't even put leaven in the bread. They just kind of threw it in the oven and pulled it out and had tortillas for dinner. They didn't have time for relaxing. Zoom, out they go. And now they turn and look. And that looking is a key word. You don't want to miss it. Keep your finger there and flip back to Matthew chapter 14. In verse 23, Yeshua had already sent the disciples away. He goes up to the mountain by himself to pray. He's going to have a little quiet time with God. The boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, that's the last 3 hours of the night, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., he came to them walking on the sea. That would flip me out, wouldn't it? Here you are, some fishermen, Peter and James and John, and here comes a guy walking on the water. Now, you've never seen anything like that. Not while you're out to sea. And the disciples saw him walking on the sea and were scared, verse 26, and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Greek word, phobos. You can't hide that. They've got walking on water phobia. I mean, something's going on here. And immediately Yeshua spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It's I, don't be afraid." And you hear this often in the record of Scripture. When you get afraid, or you get afraid, or anybody gets afraid, how are we supposed to deal with that? Oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're a big, strong guy. No, it's never the word from heaven. Don't be afraid. I'm here. This is God's answer to our fears. And it is that He is God, and He's present, and that we can know Him personally. That's the only way to solve fears. Take courage. If I say to you, many of you are still in your coats. For those listening online, it's been pretty chilly here, but I took mine off. So let's say you walked in and the heat was not on, and it's freezing, but we don't have the heater. What would I say? Take a blanket and put it on, because it's available and it'll help you. Yeshua says, take courage, because what you're missing, I've got, it's provided, it's nearby, it's accessible, and it'll help you. Courage, like from the word kur, meaning heart, be encouraged, is what he's saying. It's I, don't be afraid. Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Yeshua said, "Come." Boom. That's it. One word, that'll do. Great command. And Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Yeshua. What a great story. If that were the end, it'd be a greater story. But seeing, verse 30, the wind, he became frightened. So that's the same thing as the Jewish people at the Red Sea. Seeing the adversaries coming and chasing them, they became frightened. And he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, I love that word, Yeshua himself stretched out his hand, took hold of him, and said, "You of little faith, why did you distazo? Why did you stand divided? Why did you doubt?" The Greek is so powerful. It's not, why did you only doubt? It's, why did you believe a little and doubt a lot? Why did you stand divided? So, let's backtrack to Exodus and see that same reality is going to hit the Jewish people. As Pharaoh drew near, Exodus 14, verse 10, behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. My guess, in military fashion. And the Egyptians had a couple things going. Number one, Pharaoh's command, go get those people. Secondly, they had lost some people in the death of the firstborn. The Egyptian soldiers had seen the devastation of the land with the hail and the locusts, etc. So they know that there's a God in action who's bigger than Pharaoh. And yet, they're soldiers. They're under the command of the boss, the king of Egypt. So the Egyptians are marching. The sons of Israel looked, behold, the Egyptians were marching, and they became frightened. Who's they?
The sons of Israel.
It doesn't say that, but it's right to imagine that. It could be the Egyptians. Could be the soldiers. I think you're right, but it's not conclusive. And I like the arguments that some people use in the commentaries to discuss this. So the Jewish people became frightened, just like Peter did when he looked and he saw the wind. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Now, crying out to the Lord is a good idea. It's always a good thing to do, isn't it? What do you call crying out to the Lord? Asking for help. What's another word for that when you're asking God? Praying. Generally, crying out to God is prayer. And would anybody say prayer is not a good idea? I imagine if we went out to the streets and did a vox pop kind of thing and said, "Excuse me, we're doing a survey on prayer. You think prayer is a good idea?" Do you think God, if there is a God, would like it better if you prayed or if you didn't pray?
If you pray.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get that pretty much across the board, wouldn't we? Let's see what it says. They said to Moses, verse 11, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt?" Isn't this the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, "Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians"? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die by Midbar in the wilderness. Now, here you are, your God, right? The people are praying, crying out. They're afraid. You're a loving God. You've delivered these people. You care about them. What's your reaction? You're God. How are you going to help them? Going to send them back to Egypt? Because that's what they said. It's better if we go back to Egypt. Break the bondage officially, prevent their going back and being associated. Okay. What else are you going to stop? What are you going to do if you're God and the people are praying this kind of prayer that we read? Let's see what God does. Verse 13, Moses says to the people, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today." That's exactly what Yeshua said. Do not be afraid, take courage, it is I. So God is going to be personally involved again. Do not fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you've seen today, you will never see them again forever. Of course, that doesn't mean we can't take a bus from Israel to Sharm el-Sheikh or to Cairo, see a pyramid. What he's talking about is those Egyptians at that time, those Jews at that time. You will never see them again forever. Verse 14, the Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. In other words, stop talking. Stop praying. Your noise is not going to affect anything. So let's look at the rebukes that Moses brings to the people at the Red Sea. Number 1, do not fear, stand by. His first rebuke to the people is that they wanted to dive into the Red Sea. It's better for me to die than to go back to them, said some people who understood they were delivered. I get that. But they saw no hope as the Red Sea was there, the Yam Suf was there, and it was pretty substantial. They said, let's dive in, let's bury ourselves, kind of like happened at Masada. They're taking their own fate in their hands, committing corporate suicide, simultaneous suicide, like happened at Masada in 67 to 70 CE. It was pretty harsh. And you see that with different characters in the Bible, and certainly after the Bible. Do not fear, stand by. Secondly, see the salvation of the Lord which He'll accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you've seen, you'll never see them again. This is a rebuke to those who said, let's go back to Egypt. The people had been belly aching for decades, centuries. Come on, get us out of this. And we forget that things really were bad. You grew up in the former Soviet Union, and I grew up in the United States, and they were enemies. And when I was over there just a fortnight ago, I kept thinking that I was behind enemy lines. And it was a weird thing to keep thinking, wait, I'm in Russia. Oh my, I'm in Russia. I'm in the Cold War. And I wasn't in the Cold War. I mean, it was silly, but I still had that impression. And I remember meeting Russian Jews specifically who had come out in 1989, 1990, 91, in that real era to New York, and to Washington, D.C., and they were finally free. But they were free and had everything given to them for 70 years. Okay, sorry. Everything they had was given them, but they didn't have much. But what they knew is that they would have a potato tomorrow, and that was good. And now they have freedom, but nobody's given them a potato. And now what do I do? And freedom is itself scary, like those people you reference who came out of an abusive situation, who are adopted by others. And can you imagine if a child is abused, and now a new parent, a foster parent, reaches out to welcome that child. The child is going to see those hands as punishing hands and not welcoming hands. It is natural that many children will pull back from an adopting person or a loving person who's reaching out, thinking they're reaching out to harm instead of to welcome. So the Jewish people standing at the Red Sea traumatized in a way because of the whole Exodus event, and now come up to a substantial sea over which they cannot build a bridge, against which they find no avenue of escape. They say, well, let's dive in and die. Second group says, let's go back to Egypt. It was at least we knew where our potato was coming from. Third group that he rebukes is in verse number 14. The Lord will fight for you. So who's he rebuking there? Those who have great courage. He's saying, the Lord will fight for you. You put down that sword. There were some guys who said, let's battle all those Egyptians. As if a bunch of slaves with a handful of, rocks are going to go up against these hundreds and hundreds of chariots and all the king's horses and all the king's men. It's not going to work. The Lord will fight for you, a phrase that we see throughout the record of the Older Testament. And the fourth group that he's rebuking are the prayer warriors, while you keep silent. Now, these are not real prayer warriors. These are grumblers. Fetch, these are guys who have the ministry of grumbling. And the apostle makes it clear that we should do all things without grumbling or disputing in Philippians. And we are over and over told that the grumbling, that's such a good word, isn't it? Grumble. It's almost an onomatopoeia. I've got a bet. And it's this idea of nothing is satisfactory. I'm unhappy. And I could run it better, but I'm not even going to run it because you don't deserve me. On and on. This whole idea of dissatisfaction instead of a contentment because of God. So the fourth group that he's rebuking is the prayers, who are the crying out to God people of verse 10 and 11 and 12, but really they're not happy. Leave us alone, verse 12. Leave us alone. I don't think that's exactly God's plan. So then the Lord said to Moses, verse 15, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. You stretch out your hand. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, divide it. Sons of Israel will go through in the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They'll go in after them. I'll be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. If you don't hear that phrase over and over again so much that you get it, that God wants to use judgment and he wants to use blessing to bring honor to himself, then you've missed most of the book of Exodus. The angel of God who'd been going, verse 19, before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So here you get the cloud moving and protecting them. The pillar of cloud was guiding the Jewish people to one place and another. Now it's forming a hedge of protection between Israel and the Egyptian marauders. Verse 20, it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night, meaning no Jews and no Egyptians touched during that time. So Moses stretched out his hand, verse 21, over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into Charavah, this idea of dry land. So the waters were divided. And you know how many laneways there were? There were 12 laneways, which makes sense to get 3 million people through in one night. The waters were divided, and when waters divide, you can imagine if you got a river or a creek or an ocean and all the waters move this way or that way, the ground is still muddy. But the miracle was twofold. One, the laneways, however many there were, and secondly, the dry land. And you will hear people argue that this miracle of the Red Sea was just the Khamsim, the 50-day east wind that comes from the Arabian Peninsula. That's a typical 50-day patch of weather that's pretty harsh. And that might be, but that would not cause dry land. That might blow some water off the mud, but the mud would stay there. And the Jews walked through on dry land. So the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the Charavah, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians took up the pursuit. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. As the morning watched, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and the cloud, and brought the army of the Egyptians into, thought it was Bavel, but it's not, it's Hammam. And he caused their chariot wheels to swerve. He made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, let's get out of here. That's what they said. We're stuck in the mud. Let's flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against us. I mean, the Egyptians knew it. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen part of all of God's hand. And here are these soldiers under command going out against not Israel, but the God of Israel. These are spiritual guys. And they know this is not just a human battle. We could have taken them down. They were dumb slaves. We had the power, we had the might. We didn't have the numbers, but we had them. But they knew that there was a God who was involved. That's pretty holy. And so God said to Moses, verse 26, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. That is one of the most painful verses to read in all Bible. Here are the Egyptians who are just getting it. But they got it in the same way that the Jewish people got the instruction to be quiet. God's going to show His own glory in His own way. It's a harsh reality to say they understood, but they didn't really know. The Egyptians knew that there was a God, but that doesn't mean that they bowed to Him. They knew that they wanted to flee, but that was a fearful thing, not a worshiping thing. They were aware of God, but they didn't honor Him as God. Do you hear the difference? Because if they honored Him as God, how in the world would God then pour judgment all over them? That's inconsistent with who He is. So because He demonstrated judgment on them, it's because they did not honor Him as God. Meaning their knowledge of God was limited to common knowledge, but they didn't bow the knee. They didn't accept Him as God. They said, whoa, He's a big God. I wonder if we've got a bigger God. Because there were always battles between the gods. They considered Him as part of the divine enterprise, but not the king over all the earth. Moses stretched out his hand, verse 27, over the sea. The sea returned to its normal state at daybreak. So all night they had opportunity to repent. Darkness is a great time to repent, whether it's night or whether it's spiritual darkness. It's a great time to repent, cry out to God. The business of transacting with God is pretty important. So we've got to do that. And here they had all night to repair their relationship. They would not have driven their wheels in their chariots into the Red Sea at night. So they drove in by day. The cloud comes over them. They have all night to get out, and they stay there. Maybe wrestling with the wheels, maybe trying to repair things, maybe some fellows were beating them. We don't know the pecking order of the Egyptian army. But what we do know is that those who stayed within the walls of the Red Sea, not one of them remained. Look at verse 28. The waters returned, covered the chariots and horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. And the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Now how does that happen? How do you see dead things up on the seashore?
You get washed up.
Yeah, and that means they stood there for a while. The floods came back over the Egyptians, the chariots, the horses, and water pushed them up off the edges and onto, if you will, drier land on the shore. And if you turned around and looked, what would be your reaction? You're going to be drawn towards God. Because you walked through dry land and they didn't. Well, they started. Well, what happened to them? Whoa! We were saved. You didn't have to jump into the sea. You didn't have to go back and serve them. You didn't have to fight against them. And you had to be quiet. So God answered all 4 rebukes by doing it himself. Moses lifts up his staff and it all happens. He lifts it up again and the floods come back. Your reaction should be what happened here. Verse 31, when Israel saw the great power, meaning hand, Yad, which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared, there's Yareh, there's no doubt what that is. That's Phobos in Hebrew. They Yared the Lord. And they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Oh, that's going to sneak in again and again. This idea of Moses not being equal with God, not even close, but Moses being the representative of God. And if you're going to love God, you're going to love his person. I don't know how many times we hear it from people that they don't mind God, but this Jesus thing is a little out of sorts. Or, I like God, but this church thing, it's crazy. I'm not going to hang out with those people at Hillsong Conference this week. And I hear this over and over again. I have my own relationship to God. I don't need to go to your one new man gathering, or I don't need to go to worship service, or whatever. And I think, well, sometimes God makes it clear that there are people who rep him, and not a person like in Moses' day. Now there's heaps of places you can go and participate. Somehow when we disregard the people of God, we also are dissociating from the God of those people. When we dissociate from the people of God, we often are dissociating from the God of the people. And that doesn't work. So the people saw Moses as the instrument of God. Whoa, he is somebody. I don't know who he is. It took me a full year to sort this out. I'm glad I put the blood on the door. I'm glad we escaped. I'm glad I didn't dive in the Red Sea. But who was that guy? He's 80 years old. And I'm following him? Most people are dead by that time. Well and truly. What am I doing following this old guy? I don't know, but I'm fearing God. I've got a great, healthy respect for and literally fear of God. And I'm going to believe in God. And I'm going to believe that guy up front named Moish, he's got something to say. That's Exodus 14. It's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. Next week we're going to talk about the Song of Moses, the first of 3 times the phrase Song of Moses is used. And it's even got a chorus that's sung by Miriam, and she plays her tambourine. That'll be fun. How's Yoshir Moshe, the Song of Moses?
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia 2001. God bless you.